wrote this. Okay, so now we're recording that. I can just a little brief re-summary of what I said, so it's up there for the folks. So we will be doing the face of Christ as a Mandylion sometime beginning end of October, certainly in November. Between now and then, I would hope that those of you who are planning to paint will take the opportunity to practice and practice and practice and practice doing these different features and sketching different faces of Jesus until you reach the point that it's become second nature. So you've relaxed, you feel at home, you recognize the territory, and so you can really be creative in the right way to express the truths of who Jesus and the saints are. So it's about expressing that timeless truths which come to us through the icon and allowing oneself to be the servant of that truth. So to draw a nose, to draw a mouth, to draw an eye, to draw a face in a way that enables people just to get on with the business of being with the saints and to allow Christ and the saints to get on with the business of just being with us. So we're like John the Baptist, I must decrease so he may increase. So it's this, I suppose, a humility carved out of this artistic process, which means first of all we put in a lot of time and effort at practice, and then we are really conscious of the truths that we are trying to facilitate in our work through the work of our hands. If we have that, then I think God has a good chance of really fashioning some really beautiful icons through your hands. So take this time, both these sessions, but then the break that will come between the end of this part and the second part of the module, which could be as much as 2 months, to really discipline yourself and practice everything from doing those calligraphic lines through to really understanding how proportions and shapes work and that sort of thing, and just be relaxed about it but disciplined, so that you give yourself maybe regular time, maybe the time we would normally be having this session, at least once a week, to do that. Now, having said that, I know for some of you, you're not doing this course in order to draw and paint. You just simply want to be part of it so you can learn more. Absolutely wonderful. That's terrific. But this is really for those of you who really are serious about wanting to improve your iconography, in which case use the break to build on what you've got now. Now I noticed that some people who've been in touch with me have wanted to be doing a lot more than we've been covering so far. They're trying to run before they can walk. And honestly, when I look back to my training, which was very sort of piecemeal, if only I'd have had the time to build up my skill set slowly. To the luxury of spending a week just drawing eyes, for example, or painting eyes, and looking at different models and finding out and comparing and seeing what the different styles, how they do them different, rather than getting overwhelmed by the whole face or a whole icon or a whole festal scene. Just being able to really dig in and spend time with these precious jewels, really, and being able to handle them and cherish them, and just play with them without any expectation that you're going to have to show me or anybody else. This is a real freedom. So please, can you if you're doing the course to improve your iconography, can you please try and build something in during these coming weeks? Okay. And anybody wants any guidance on that, just send me an email or a message, and I'll try and give you a little bit of some indicators of what you might do. So today, noses, the humble nose, and yet so distinctive in the icon, so distinctive. So first of all, I want to I've done a little recording which will look at the way the face looks and what the purpose of the senses are in the life of the saint, and therefore in what we're trying to convey when we paint. And then I've got as usual, the practical demonstration of how you do the nose in the icon. Okay, so that's our little program today. Iconography brings our faith tradition about God and how he is at work as the lover of mankind, saving us, delivering us, transfiguring us, together with the actual people who've experienced that theosis, that deification, that sanctification, those who we call the saints, who are living now in heaven. And the tradition gives us a visual language to express that transformation accurately, while the people themselves bring their own individual characteristics which God gave them when he created them. Now, sometimes in icons it can seem that the saints appear rather generic, that they've lost something of their individuality, and that's especially true of women's saints. However, this is not because the tradition demands that there should be this sort of anonymity, but rather it's a consequence of details being lost. Maybe records were not kept, or a particular saint had never had their icon painted until maybe sometime after their death. For whatever reasons, some saints, we lost the knowledge of their appearance. So a more generic form has tended to be used. Might even be just the practicalities of an iconographer being asked to paint so and so, and not having any examples to inspire him, and so he's been reduced to having to produce a more generic picture. And if you think about it, at the very least, the icon has to have the name of the saint actually very clearly written on it. Without that, it's not an icon. So the idea that the icon tradition is trying to get away with the particular identities, the characteristics of specific people, really is not the case. However, what would be said, I think, quite rightly, is that in the icons, their individuality is contextualized by the manner of their living with Christ. So, for example, if they are a martyr holding a cross, maybe dressed in a red garment, if they're apostles, if they are ascetics and warrior saints and so on, they will have a certain, as it were, uniform that comes with their place in the firmament of heaven. And that the tradition, as it were, clothes them with, so that we can more easily understand their significance for us in our Christian lives, and indeed as we worship with them in heaven. However, their individuality does endure, and most particularly in their face. And I want to look a little bit about faces and this individuality and how it was understood, especially in the early church period when iconography emerged. Now, let's begin by saying, obviously, in the icon, we are not dealing with a photographic or naturalistic likeness. There is a certain style where the sensuality has been removed and the essence of their appearance has been preserved. And trying to understand how this works is part of what this is about. Now, the distinctiveness of a person's face rests especially in their features, so eyes, nose, mouth, the expressive parts of our face. So in the icon, they're just as important as in nature, but they are done in a very particular way, and because they aren't as in a naturalistic portrait, it is important to understand the principles that are involved. So last week we looked at eyes, for example. This week we're going to look at noses. And if we can understand how the principal ways in which features are shown in the icon, then we can see how they're applied to particular likenesses. So you've got a two-step place. You've got understanding how the icon does a nose, for example, in principle, and then applying that to the particular look or characteristics of a particular saint. Now, the icon emerged during the era of the early church, fathers and mothers, during the transition between late antiquity and the Byzantine era. And this was a time when paganism was passing away and being replaced by the Christian vision of the gospel of the human person and so forth. And one of the ideas that was very, very popular in the pagan world at that time was the idea of reading a face, a bit like you read tea leaves. And they had a sort of pseudoscience called physiognomy, with deductions being made from the shape of the head, resembling an animal, for example, or nationalistic traits. Say Egyptians having a particular physiognomy, and if you had that, then you'd have the traits of that particular people. Now, Christians shied away from this way of thinking, but they were interested in knowing the quality of the interior soul, of the life, of the spirit of a person. And so unlike their pagan neighbours, they were not looking with suspicion to find hidden vice and malice as a sort of discerning of witchcraft and that sort of stuff. But rather they were looking to discover the biblical patriarchs, the prophets or the angels living among them. Now, as far back as Homer, so the ancient Greeks, the connection between bodily appearance and the quality of the character of a person had been explored and noted. Now, Christian teachers didn't refer to the manuals on physiognomy, but they nevertheless developed their own way of reading the faces of the saints to reveal the grace-filled soul, something not tied to ethnicity or the resemblance of certain animals, but to something rather different, focused on what they called, or we call, the ascetic look. Now, we get a very clear idea of what we mean by this if you look at the accounts made of pilgrims going to not just the holy sites and tombs of holy people who had already died, what we would think of as the saints, but to people they saw as living saints, living in remote areas of the desert, or like Simon Stylites famously living his life on top of this column. People they knew as the ascetics, who were seen as these sort of people living in the hinterland of this world and on the cusp of the next. And for these pious people, what really, really mattered was seeing the face of the holy person. For example, as one of the visitors to the great Saint Anthony of Egypt, revered as the father of monasticism, one of the visitors had constantly coming to see the saint, but he didn't say anything, just sat there. And so one day St. Anthony said to him, you come here frequently, yet you never ask for anything. What is it you want? And the man replied, it is enough for me to see you, Father. It's enough for me to see you, Father. And sitting there and gazing on to the holy man was itself what he'd come for, to feast on the vision of holiness incarnated in this holy man. Now, some ascetics actually promise that no human will see my face, and some went to considerable lengths to hide their face, So the face was really important, both for the pilgrim coming to see them, but also a sense of that withdrawal that the ascetic has, that the monk has, not being seen, a hidden life. And so some of them would only see visitors, say, through a small grill so that they couldn't be seen. And there's a story of a holy man called John, who there was a pious woman desperate to see him, and he refused, absolute category. And she was absolutely adamant she wanted to see his face. And eventually her husband sort of persuaded the holy man that he should visit. And the holy man said, well, I will come in a dream. And he duly did. And when he came, he remonstrates to her, and he says, why have you desired to see my face? Am I a prophet, or do I stand in the ranks of the just? And he really sort of remonstrates with her and tells her off. But that association that was made there, that you would want to see him because he is among the saints. And that's precisely why people coming to these holy people wanted to see them, because somehow gazing on the face of the holy person was to commune with them and to share in their life of grace. Now, St. Jerome, one of these ascetics who lived in Bethlehem for a time, explains what they call the eye of faith, both in terms of the pilgrimage of his disciple, who was a nun called Paula, who in each holy man she believed that she was seeing Christ. That's how he puts it. And in the same way as the apostles looked on Jesus. So he's saying this eye of faith, the way Paula was looking on these ascetics, these holy people, was exactly the same way that the apostles looked on Jesus in his lifetime. So it was a sort of profound means of becoming close to God, becoming close to Christ, was to look on the face of these ascetics. So seeing here is about a penetrating gaze, a stillness that reveals hidden depths, rather than that sort of reading the tea leaves sort of thing that was in the pagan world. So we see here a wonderful way in which Christianity transformed something as basic as how you looked at somebody. And this is what is being reflected in how the Christian community came to paint the saints, especially as they were represented in the places of worship. Now, this desire to scrutinize the ascetic body, and particularly the face, is a recurrent theme in pilgrims' descriptions of their own experiences. And there's a very good book, which I will put the details up, which you might be interested in reading. It touches on this whole thing about pilgrimage and seeing, and most of what I'm saying today is coming from that. Now, this ascetic face was of particular significance for Christians of the ancient world, and for example in the Life of Antony written by St. Athanasius. The moment that pilgrims laid eyes on the saint's face became moments instantaneously of healing and conversion. The gaze, the looking upon, the communion with these holy people was all about looking on the faces. And at the same time, there was a certain, as it were, visual profile that was associated with the ascetic. There was a bishop talking to John Cassian, who was a famous monk of that period. He said, "Old age and holiness, in bodies now bent over, shine so brightly in their faces that the mere sight of them is able to teach a great deal to those who gaze upon them." So not making this up, this is actually the words of a bishop from those early centuries when iconography was beginning to emerge. Now, what were these sort of visual characteristics of these ascetics? Well, hair was a distinguishing feature. Being wild or long or unkempt, as well as long uncut beards. And these were noted, for example, by a guy called Theodoret, reporting on the appearance of Theodosius, a well-known ascetic of the time. And again, the descriptions of another guy called Euthymius, his long beard, or Daniel the Stylite, who was described as, and I quote, a very hairy monk. James of, now this is going to get me, Seristica, had become accustomed to having his hair plucked by the people coming to see him as a sort of relic. So the significance of beards were very much de rigueur in the descriptions of these male ascetics. And their appearance with sunken eyes and emaciated cheeks and even thinning hair. But above all, the one characteristic that stands out is the radiancy of their faces, that they had a sort of divine light that was coming forth. And St. Athanasius described St. Anthony when he was close to death, and he said, his face had a great and marvellous grace. From the soul's joy, his face was cheerful as well. When the heart rejoices, the countenance is cheerful, but when it is in sorrow, the countenance is sad. Now, St. Theodore of Cyrus describes seeing Eusebius of Tellada in this way. His look was not at times not at times and at others cheerful, but his eyes always preserved the same orderliness. They were sufficient proof of the calm of his soul. The calm of his soul being seen in his face, and above all in those eyes. Now, we get a bit of a thing when it comes to female saints, where they're described in rather different types. Obviously, they don't have these big beards, but obviously female beauty is viewed in a rather different light than male beauty. And when it comes to the way in which ascetic women are described, it's the way in which they've lost that exterior beauty, but gained the beauty of their soul. So, for example, it said of Pelagia that she had become ugly. Her pretty eyes had become hollow and cavernous as the result of much fasting and the keeping of vigils. But then this was a woman who who disguised herself as a man. So perhaps there's some other way of assessing things here. But it seemingly nuns pretending to be monks, being men, was not unusual. So it's quite an interesting phenomena here. So anyway, when we talk about women, they've got this the sort of emaciated look of the eyes and losing that sort of gentle, beautiful skin. But again, as with the male saints, they have this radiancy of light, this transfigured facial appearance. So, for example, Syncletica, who was a female hermit of the Jordan desert, they said that her face would give off flashing sparks of light. Now, this is very much, again, like St. Pambo, and it said, who received the image of the glory of Adam when his face shone like lightning, and he was like a king sitting on a throne. Or Abba Or. He was about 90 years old and had a brilliant white beard down to his chest, and his face was so radiant that the sight of him alone filled one with awe. Paul the Simple, they simply say he had a shining face. And all of this is pointing not to the marks of a body wearied by asceticism, but having clearly shown in their faces a foretaste of the transfigured physiognomy of the resurrected state. So it's about gazing on heaven, a foretaste of all these things that have been promised in the gospel, the hope that breaks forth in the Christians, seeing that all these things they've heard about in the gospel, from the transfiguration to the appearance of Moses, for example, with the face bright and had to be covered by a veil, it was happening in their own time. And, these people going on these pilgrimages went to see this. It was a sort of validation of their hope. So you can imagine when it comes to painting these saints, it this is the thing that people are trying to grasp. And when you look at the face in the icon, what you see is this radiant light, these flashes of light that they talked about there, of that sister in the desert. And really what the hermeneutical tool, the interpretive tool that was being used, was the typology of the Bible. So looking at Moses, looking at the Transfiguration as the key to unlock the meaning of the Christian life, and seeing signs of its authenticity in what they were seeing around them in those who had really given up all to follow Christ. So it was taking the Bible and seeing it being reflected and lived out in the lives of people of their own time, which both made it accessible to them, but also a demand on them to keep going in the way of holiness. Now, having said all of that, we shouldn't think that therefore the particular look of a saint, their particular characteristics, was not important. They have an identity, they have a name, and so these ascetics, I've been able to quote them by name. They are particular people. And in the icon, from the earliest times, we see particular personalities having very particular traits. So, for example, if we look at the apostles Peter and Paul. Now, Peter and Paul, you can see them here, heroes of the early church, foundation of the College of Bishops, towering figures who were graced by God to establish the church on earth. And that image of St. Peter with the tight cropped curly white beard, quite a thick stubby nose, and then that short cropped full head of hair, from the earliest times has been consistently reproduced. And I'm going to show you now this image here, and you can see this is St. Peter with that same white hair, full mop of hair, tight beard, quite squat, square face. And this is in the catacombs. It was only discovered just a couple of years ago. So every time we keep going back another layer, another period in time, we find that these images which have become commonplace to us, their origins go right back to when we first got evidence. So these characteristics of a particular person were preserved in many, many, many cases. So St. Paul with his high forehead, that narrow pointed beard, and a more aquiline nose becomes standard at the same period. And St. Peter, as I say here, with this much shorter white beard and that full crop of hair, so that you can immediately recognize him 9 times out of 10 anyway, depending on the skill of the artist, to reproduce this likeness. So this is important in the icon, and it's one of the challenges of iconography when we've got a new saint, for example, there's photographs of them like John Henry Newman or something like that, or St. Paisios, to take that likeness and to interpret it within an iconographic style. So in order to do that, we do really need to be able to know how to do a nose iconographically, a mouth iconographically, the eyes iconographically. Now, last week we looked at eyes, so the next part of our toolbox that I'm equipping you with is going to be the nose, and we're going to look at that now. Okay, so that was a bit of an intense presentation. Sorry for that, but I wanted to really put the development of the iconographic face in that early church period. It wasn't just coming out of nowhere. The early church was on a journey of discovery, of experience, and the art of the liturgy that developed during those first 8 centuries happened in this sort of context. So if you want to look at an icon and understand it, what's happening, why is it done the way it's done, by going back into the early church and looking at how they were reflecting on things, it helps us to understand what we continue to do. So we're going back to the source, we're going back to the roots and building up our understanding from there. So I hope that makes sense. I do have the text of that presentation, so I will try and get that up on the web page. Okay, so you can print that off and read that over your morning coffee or something, whenever it is you take time just to have a sort of gentle read. So don't worry if you didn't get all of that and it was a bit confusing. I will make sure that that's available. The text is available for you. And the name of the book I did put up here: The Memory of the Eyes, Pilgrims to the Living Saints in Christian Late Antiquity. Okay, so that's the book. I got it on Kindle. It's not terribly long, but if that whole thing just excited you, I would I'd really go for it. Okay. Right, let me take that off. Ian, are there any other books on the lives of the saints that you recommend? Well, I suppose, especially when you're doing the life of a saint, doing an icon of a saint, then one of the things you should be doing is researching their life. So there's a range of like Butler's Lives of the Saints, which is a bit old but is quite thorough. The Breviary, for example, gives little summaries of the saints' lives and gives you the prayers to go with them. In the Orthodox Church, there's Troparions and all the liturgical books where you'll find the feasts commemorated of particular saints. That's very important. So don't just think of, I've got to read a history. These are people you pray to. So the liturgical context is just as important. So using the prayers that the church gives us, that helps nourish the soil by which we're coming to the canvas to do our work. So put that in context. But having said that, there are lots of sort of compendium of the lives of the saints, like the Penguin Book of Saints and things like that. Also, we live in this wonderful age of the internet and Google and Wikipedia, and it's wonderful the amount of information that you can dig up. So when I was doing St. Editha for a church in Tamworth, which is in the middle of England, last year, I was able to look at all sorts of documents and arguments about who she was. She's a very obscure English saint. People aren't sure really exactly who she is. So one of the things I had to do was research her life, and I wrote it up as a little summary to say, well, this is who I think the saint is that I'm painting. And that was an important part of me getting to know her and understanding her mission that she'd been given to these people in central England, and continues to have that relationship with them. So I try to root it in her history. So the internet gives you a wonderful opportunity to dig into this sort of thing. So I would just say dig free, and use Google. Use Google and Wikipedia. Those are pretty solid places to begin. And usually with Wikipedia, it will give you links, so you can follow those links. And also it will give you some images, which is sometimes useful. And what I do, I use Evernote, which is a computer program, and I collect all the stuff into Evernote, and then I've got it all sort of gathered together, a bit like a scrapbook really. So when I'm actually then coming to the design phase, I've got that all or really close. So I recommend that. Britannia Gloria, the glory of Britain, shows British and Irish saints from the 1st to 11th century. Yeah, and there's lots of really interesting books, especially on the Anglo-Saxon period, which is amazing really, because there's very little evidence. But it's amazing what people have been able to come up with. And they're speculating. It's like understanding St. Editha, my little paper, which you'll find on my website. It's in the blog section. It's a speculation, but I think it's fairly sound. Where I managed to put some things together and make some connections. But this is going on all the time, especially with these more obscure saints, like Saint Herbert of Derwentwater in the Lake District, who was a hermit living on an island. Now, I've got to do one of Saint Herbert for a friend of mine. It's the program I use is called Evernote. I just use it's a note-taking program. So if you're on Google and you find a page you like, you can just click a button and it will capture that page, and then you've got it all together, and you can. It's like a scrapbook, really. Some people use it in a very sophisticated way, but I've never managed to do that. It's all a bit clumsy, but it sort of works. So let's now look at how you do a nose, that generic way in which a nose is done. We've seen St. Peter and St. Paul, which can be done very distinctively, but there is a way that you do a nose in the icon, and I would like to play that to you now. Okay, so what I want to do now is to take a look at how you draw the nose. Now, one of the things we've got to be really careful about is understanding the angle of the head, because obviously if I'm looking straight at you, you can see both my nostrils are an equal size, and likewise the angle here are equal, they're parallel on either side. Whereas if I move more around like this, eventually you see only one nostril, and the angles here vary quite considerably. So in the icon we reflect nature, but it's going to be, as it were, desensualized, and so we're going to have a little bit of a sort of formulaic basis to the nose, which can then be adapted for different characters. So here I'm going to do 3 noses, and each nose is going to have 3 parts to it. It's going to have a teardrop shape at the bottom. It's going to have slightly convex series of lines for the middle section, and then it's going to have this quite definite shape at the top of the nose, which is something which we don't really have in nature. So let's first draw from straight on. So we're going to put in a sort of teardrop shape like that, and then we're going to have 2 lines coming like that. Notice that across here is wider than across there, and then we're going to have a sort of V shape up at the top like that. And then slightly up from the bottom of the teardrop, we're going to have the bottom of the nostrils. And the nostrils sort of tuck in basically where the teardrop meets the incoming line there. The same on both sides. And then you're going to have a shadow in here and here for the nostril. And then this is coming down, and then thin, thick, thin, thin, thick, and then thin, thick, thin. Maybe just a little touch of a line here. Bring that round. Across like that. And then on one side you're going to have more of a shadow than the other. Let's put it that way. It comes all the way down and then a lighter sort of shadow on that side. So notice that this here is narrower than the gap between there and there. This is set up, and then you've got your nostrils made with 2 little teardrops, and then you've got this sort of teardrop shape there, and then you can always just clean it up a little bit like that. So you've got one side which is slightly darker, a little bit of shadow going up there, a little bit of shadow there, and less of a shadow here, and a little bit of a line there, and then coming around like that. Now that's from straight on. Now if we did it from the side, you have that same sort of middle bit concaving like that, but obviously it's at an angle now because the nose sticks out. And then on this side the line continues straight up, but here it sort of angles across, so it's a sharper angle here than on this one, and this one has gone even more acute, while this line has moved right across, so it makes it sort of continuous. And then your teardrop sort of swivels round a little bit, so instead of being straight up like that, it's slightly to an angle like that, and this line comes down and just continues round, and then you've got more of a nostril because you don't see the other nostril at all. Put a shadow on this side. Light one there. Got that strong third eye, and then the teardrop coming in across there like that, a bit stronger there. Thin, thick, thin, thin, thick, thin, and so on. So this one we've got no nostril on the right hand side, just on the left hand side. Got those angles right, and the bulbous bit at the end of the nose has slightly swung round. But in most faces you'll find that they are at a slight turn, so this is still fairly straight, the main bit of the nose, as is the bottom bit. Here it's beginning to go that way, and that's beginning to lose its continuance with this line. And actually if you look, that comes and stops there, and if you sort of go to diagonal across, that's going to start there and come up. And then we're going to get one bit of nostril here and more on that side. Remember to not to make this too close to that. So thin, thick, thin, that round, that over, and then put this shadow in, and right through the nostril. Not forget our special top section, and then a little bit of shadow on this side, and that nostril again, teardrop just at the bottom there, that coming round like that. That's stopped there, that's come there. So that gives you a basic construction of the nose. Now that will vary. St. Peter's nose is going to be thicker here and more bulbous at the bottom, so a bit like that. Our Lady's nose is going to be much thinner, so you get this sort of thing. Same principle, but varying the the length of the shape and the width of it, and that gives a much more feminine, elegant nose than maybe something like this, which would be more typical of an average man. So lots of variables once you get into it. The depth of shadow, the shape up here. It can be sort of this sort of squarish shape, or it can be a sort of V shape. There's a range of possibilities. So look very carefully at that, and there's no particular reason for choosing one the other than for the aesthetic look. So this sort of one is fairly solid, but it's going to that nice graceful point, so that's quite elegant. Something which is more of a sort of block gives an idea of strength, but at the expense of elegance. And then something that's like this is really quite spindly, which can give a sense of refinement and delicacy. So, for example, for a female saint. But there's no hard and fast rules about that. So the nose, we're going to build it up with those thin layers of paint. That will give us lots of flexibility if we don't get things quite right. Put it in very lightly at the beginning. You build up those layers, you have a lot of control. And as I say, if you make mistakes, it's easier to correct if it's a very thin wash of paint. If it's too thick, you end up creating a real mess. So a little patience at the beginning can really deliver great results. So if we look at a nose, we've got a very distinctive shadow on that side. So I'm going to start by getting that angle in there, bringing that out a little bit, and then in, just putting this shadow in. And the side there like that. And then I'm going to put this there we are, put that. So there's the teardrop coming in. So using this very light paint gives me the ability just to correct little bits there which weren't so as I wanted them. And we'll just wash a bit of paint over there. And then getting that in there, so that's there and that's to there. As it turns round, you find that there's a sort of stagger between the points where the bridge meets the main part of the nose. So that's coming like that, and this is coming slightly lower, and then round and then coming in, and this is going to be more out here. See, because I did that quite lightly, I can easily correct that. And then that, and then push that up like that. A little bit of shadow in here. But I'm going to be careful with this because this side remains a very slight shadow, except up here where it's meeting the nose. Yep, there's the eyebrow. And then let's put this shadow across for that distinctive third eye. Strengthen that now. I'm going to put the shadow on the bottom here, giving that round circular shape to the here, extending the shadow a little bit, but not too much. So now I'm going to strengthen my paint a little bit. Thin, thick, thin. Here a teardrop, and here a teardrop. And then I'm going to strengthen that bottom line there. The bottom line of the nostrils, like that, so you've got a nice gentle shape. Now I'm going to strengthen the shadow on this side of the nose. So one side is dark, one side. So notice how that shadow's coming right out really as far as the nostril. There we are. One of the things which I've noticed is that a lot of people who are learning iconography stop too soon. So they look at the nose or the eye or whatever and think, oh, that looks all right, and they stop. But one of the key things is being able to push yourself to keep going, to take it to the next level and the next level after that. So if you notice where I got to with that that little monochrome, I think a lot of you would have said, oh, I finished. You know, let your hands up, I can go and have my cup of tea, wonderful. But actually, being able to push yourself to keep going and not to do too much. So as you move further, you're doing less and less. So you're putting on less and less paint, but more and more accurately. So the nostril, for example, it's just a real dot of darkness in just the right place. The strength of the line on one side of the nose, just in the right place. And what happens, I think, when we are learning, or the beginning of our learning, is we just keep repeating what we did on the first step, and we don't subtly change it as we move to the next steps. So as you're watching the rest, I'm going to continue to play the little demonstration now, but as you're looking at this, try and look really carefully at what I'm doing differently to what I did the first time round. I'm not just repeating it, I'm really becoming more specific as I use stronger paint. Okay, so let's now I'm going to stronger paint, so I can put in a little teardrop there. Notice I'm beginning there and then drawing it to the side of the main part of the nose. And now I'm just going to put a thin, thick line around there. I'm going to just put a little bit defining line there, because the nose is slightly turned. It's got a little bit more of a defined edge there. And then thin, thick, thin, like that. And thin, thick, like that. And then I'm just going to edge that there. And just part of the way up there. Strengthen that nostril again. and then here, thin, thick, thin, just sort of going like that. Going back to more washy paint to strengthen this shadow, but not as strong as those lines I just put on. Again, blend that ground. Want to darken that shadow a little bit. Blend that. So now you can see very much that we've got the highlight on one side of the nose, not dead in the middle. See how the nose is getting that curved surface. Strengthening that there. All the way around like that. Strengthen that. Like that. As you move to those final points, you are really having to be very specific and really control your brush strokes, because, for example, if you do the teardrop in the nostril, if you get that right, it creates a really, really elegant, sublime shape. If you just sort of plonk it in, it can make him look as though he's got a nosebleed. So it's really important to try to, as you're doing these final bits, to really control your brush. So doing those thin, thick, thin lines, especially like on the edge of the nose, really, really important. Get that right, and it will sing. It will just be in heaven. But if you can't do a nice continuous line, and you're going, say, that's all right earlier on, but at the end you really need it to flow as one stroke. Thin, thick, thin. So it's at this point that it really sort of reveals the strength of your skill set, because even though it's maybe just one little line, it really transforms it, or it holds it down. So it's the sort of thing that begins to reveal how much practice you've done in your lines and this sort of stuff. And you can often rescue a feature at that stage, because you can just sort of push it back some way. So for example, maybe the eyes are a little too narrow. By putting that final highlight, the final line for the eyelash, that thin, thick, thin line, you can move it up just a little bit, and it just gives it that much more room to look. Or maybe the iris has gone a little bit too rounded. Well, with those fine lines, you can just push, that 0.5 millimeter just to open it up a little bit. So that final step is really, though it's minimal what you're putting on, can be really quite transformative. So try and pace yourself so you don't rush those final steps. They need as much concentration as all the other bits do, which in terms of time or coverage of the paper is more significant. So a couple of questions. Will I be discussing the proportions of the various parts of the nose and how it relates to the other features? Well, I suppose I could, as that would be helpful. So the proportion, basically the bulb at the bottom is, take that as one measurement. The middle section is 1.5 measures, and then that top bit is half a measure. Okay, so that's basically it. Now in some this is a little smaller, but not much smaller. Sometimes this element becomes a bit longer, but in some this appears very much quite thin and not so bulky, and likewise here. So different noses, the proportions change a little bit, but the basic relationship between them all is 1, 1.5, half. And then the length of the nose is usually not from the bottom here, but from where the nostrils are to the midsection here. So that's your nose length, and the length of your nose is roughly the distance between the pupils. So if the eye is over this side, it comes across there and they come moving together. Okay. If you look on the seed of life diagram, something the proportion of the face, that's all in the manual. So if you look up the student manual, you'll find the proportions and stuff will be there. Okay. And I am redoing the manual and posting bits up, but you'll find that in the complete manual that's already up there. So the distance between the pupils is one nose length. Okay. And if you look at the seed of life, remember we were looking at all those faces of Jesus and how, depending on the direction it's looking, you have those little blue circles, which are the double the nose length. How that sort of, as they overlap, defining this inner area here, and then the coming down and the nose sort of resting in relationship to that, and the mouth just below that. Okay, so that's in the first session that we did. So you've got the video of that, and then you've got the manual to look at as well. Okay, can the upper part of the nostril be more understated? So you mean these bits, and at the top? Well, it usually sort of is stronger, more defined at the bottom, just like in nature. If you look, it sort of then peters out as it goes up into the side of the nose, and you do that by first of all doing a thin line round it, so it's a thicker line at the bottom here, and then thinning out as it comes up to here. And then remember, we do the lines several times to get the intensity, and each time you do it, you're doing less and less. So instead of starting right at the top and coming all the way around, all one thick heavy line, it should be thinner at the top and only done maybe once. But when you come to the bottom part where it's a darker shadow, you're maybe going to do it 3 times, sort of going over it to bring up that strength of line, which will create a sense of shadow, and that pushes this further forward. It's the same when you turn your head one side. You see how there's over here there's a deeper, it's quite deep, so there's a stronger shadow here than on this side, which is more sweeping across. Okay, any other questions, everybody? Because we've come to the end of our hour and a little bit. So if people have any questions, this is the time to post them up. Next week we'll be doing the mouth. Okay. And then the week after that will be beards and hair. And I've already recorded the demos for these, so that will be up. And if you'll find it, the commentary that I've done first, like the sort of more of the theology and stuff for it, if you're finding that is a bit boring, then please tell me, and I can maybe trim that sort of input down. If you're finding that's really interesting, that's great, but I want to try and get the pitch of the class right, and I don't want for people to lose people's interest and enthusiasm, because that's one of the things. Thank you, Charles. That if this is right for you, that's great. But if you're finding it, say, it's just a bit too much or a bit too dense, and you'd like it broken down any further, then all those hints are really, really useful, because I'm doing this so that you find it interesting and learn something and can grow in your iconography, not to suit me. So if there are any comments, please do send them to me. And if it's one saying it's really boring, send it me in a private note. So my ego is preserved from public humiliation. Yeah, I'll try. Thanks, Bridget. I will try to post up some books and things. I tend to pick things from all different sort of places, and I will try to get the texts as part of the manual. So I've put up there's the manual, and then there's this section that I'm doing as we go along. I'll try and put that into there so that it goes with the sections we're doing. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for the well, yes, quite. Spelling, well, that's no guarantee that my spelling is correct, by the way. I'm a notoriously bad speller. And then you get the autocorrect, which changes things anyway. So, it's just can be quite demanding. But thanks for the prayers. Do keep them going. Hopefully, so I can get this move now all in the bag. I've already started packing. Nothing like enthusiasm, huh? But there's quite a lot of things to do now in terms of like booking the removals, buying a car, a left-hand drive 4x4 small car. It's quite specific what I need. And then getting everything ready for the other end, like in terms of renovations and stuff. So prayers very much appreciated, and it's great having you sort of on the journey. And hopefully some of you will get the chance to come out and spend some time in this wonderful retreat, being able to spend a week or two painting icons in this sort of idyllic sort of context. So it's for your benefit too. All right, everybody, take care, God bless, and look forward to seeing you this time next week.